Hello, everybody. Welcome back to The Informed Citizen. I am your host, Dwayne Brown. This week's video is going to be fourth in a series of videos on the government. I have previously talked about the federal government, and I talked about the different branches of the federal government. We talked about the legislative slash the Congress. We talked about the executive branch, the office of the presidency, and we also talked about the judicial branch that encompasses the Supreme Court and the lower courts. This week's video is going to talk about state governments. We're going to talk about its basic structure and its basic function. So without much further delay, let's get into this week's discussion on state governments on The Informed Citizen. State governments, structure and functions. Now the first question would be, well, why is this important anyway? Well, the reason why it's important, as I said, is for three reasons. First of all, the state government is closer in proximity to you and your needs than the federal government. You may have heard people talking about governing from a distance. You know, when Washington, D.C., the White House passes laws, those laws are on a national level, and they affect the entire union. They don't often get into the details or the unique needs of your particular city or district that you live in. So the governing body that more closely affect you comes from your state and city governments and not so much from the federal government. Now, I realize that in the news, the federal government, especially when we're talking about the president and the Supreme Court, does enjoy more of a high profile status in the news media. And we collectively can get caught up in the discussions about, national politics and what's going on in Washington, D.C. But honestly, if you're looking to make an impact on your life in particular, you need to focus more locally, dealing more with the city government and with state government. So that's one reason why it's important. Another reason why it's important is because the only way this government works, whether we're talking about the local or the federal government, is citizen participation. That is the most important entity in any government. Citizen participation is essential to effecting change and to hold leaders accountable. Here in America, we are uniquely positioned, especially with our power to vote, to directly and in some cases indirectly affect how things go in our nation. People govern us by our consent. Governing power comes from the people. Elected officials are elected to represent our needs. So collectively, if we understand how government is put together, how it works, we'll be in a better position to participate as citizens and to affect the change that we're all looking for. And thirdly, it kind of goes along with the second point. An apathetic population, a population of citizens that are ill-informed, uneducated, or can care less, is one of the most potent ways that a society could get its downfall. We tend to think about the United States, it's been around for 200 years, as being this country that's going to last forever. We think that its foundations are ironclad. It is not. Civilizations have persisted for a lot longer than the U.S. have, and they have failed. It is something, despite how secure it feels, that we have to be on guard against. Being on guard against the fall of our society is hinged upon our citizens getting good information and using that information for the cause of good. So to that point, when we're having political discourse and we're trying to understand anything that's happening, it's important that our sources be legitimate. For this video, the sources I'm using comes from votesmart.org, comes from law.cornell.edu, worldatlas.com, constitution.congress.gov, merriam-webster.com, a website called ushistory.org, and from the Fulton County Government.gov website. So the first question is, what exactly is a state? Well, a state is a political subdivision of a body of people that occupies a territory defined by frontiers. The state is sovereign in its territory, also referred to as its jurisdiction, and has authority to enforce a system of rules over the people living inside of it. That system of rules is commonly composed of a constitution, statutes, regulations, and common law. Now, when talking about the state, a lot of time what also comes up in conversation are commonwealths and U.S. territories. Now, a commonwealth, if we look at the archaic definition of the word commonwealth, simply refers to the common good. Or it can also refer to an organization of participants engaged in a exercise that benefits all the participants. In the United States, we have 4 commonwealths: the Commonwealth of Kentucky, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Now, when we're talking about commonwealths, as referred to the United States, there is no difference between a state and a commonwealth. The distinction is in the name alone. So often we say there are 50 states. I guess it's more accurate to say that there are 46 states and 4 commonwealths. But either way you want to define it, it's understood that a state and a commonwealth is functionally the same thing. We also have U.S. territories. Now, unlike states and commonwealths, U.S. territories are possessions of the United States. Some of these possessions of the United States have people living in them, and some have people not living in them. So those are referred to as corporated and non-incorporated. The ones that have citizens that living in them, those citizens are afforded certain rights that the rest of the citizens in the different states and commonwealths would have, but they don't have certain other rights. For example, if you talk about Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico is allowed to send a delegate of representatives to Congress, to the U.S. Congress, but they do not have a vote when it comes to passing legislation in Congress. So there's some representation there. They enjoy some of the rights of citizens, but they don't have full participation that the rest of the U.S. Population would have. In dealing with the United States territories, they are Puerto Rico, Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Northern Marina Islands, American Samoa, Midway Atoll, Palmyra Atoll, Baker Island, Holland Island, Jarvis Island, Johnson's Atoll, Kingsman's Reef, Wake Island, and the Vast Island. So how are states structured? All states and commonwealths are modeled after the federal government. That is guaranteed by Article 4, Section 4 of the United States Constitution, which states, the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion and on application of the legislature or of the executive when the legislature cannot be convened against domestic violence. So what does that mean? A republican form of government. In the United States, we live in a democracy and is often referred to as a democratic country we live in. However, we live in a special type of democratic government. We have a republican form of government. And what that simply means is we as citizens do not collectively vote on individual legislation to get passed or different issues that affect us. What we do is we vote for representatives, and those representatives act on our behalf. So that's where you get into the House of Representatives and the senators. They are all Congress people, and all of them are elected to decide on issues based on whatever qualifications that we think qualifies them for them to act on our behalf, to act as agents for our benefit. So that's what we have on the national level. We talked about in previous videos. We have a executive branch, a judicial branch, and a legislative branch. The same thing happens within the states. So within the states, we often have the same three structure level that we see on the on the federal government level. So on the federal government level, the chief executive officer in charge of enforcing the laws of the country is the president of the United States. On the state level, that is the governor. Now, one of the differences between a governor and a president, outside of the scope and of his powers and what they're responsible for, the president is not elected directly by the people of the United States. As we talked about in a previous video, the citizens, typically on that first Tuesday in November, every 4 years, vote for electors. And those electors are the one who cast the votes for the president. On the state level, the citizens themselves directly vote for the governor. So the governor is the highest level chief executive officers that is directly voted for by people in the United States. Now, on the federal level, we have a Congress, and we talked about how the U.S. Congress is bicameral, composing of a House of Representatives and a Senate. Well, on the state level, that Congress, quote unquote, is often referred to as an assembly. And in most states, the assemblies are also bicameral. So there's usually a general assembly that is composed of a House of Representatives and state senators. Now, the number of representatives on the state level assembly as opposed to the Congress is generally different also. On the federal level, if we're talking about United States House of Representative members, the number that exists in the House per state is going to be based on the population of the state that they represent, right? So let's say that New York has more people in it than, say, the state of Iowa. So New York is going to have more House members. A similar thing applies on the state level. So the state representatives come from congressional districts that are decided upon by the state itself. When we go over to the state Senate side, the same thing applies. So on the federal level, each state has 2 senators, as guaranteed by the United States Constitution. However, the way states are broken down into different districts, each of those districts, which is going to number more than 2, vote for state senators to represent them in the state assembly. So in a lot of states, you're going to see that state senators number somewhere between 20, 30, even 40 people. And that's a big difference, though. So when you talk about the federal senators in the U.S. Senate, you only have 2 per state. But when you get down to the state level, you can have somewhere between 30 to 40 state senators. And it all depends on which district they were voted out of. And also, like the federal government, there is a Supreme Court that is the final arbiter within that particular state. So just as it is in the federal government, there's the state Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land. There are circuit courts that are courts of appeals, and there are district courts where cases and trials begin. On the state level, the same thing applies. So there are lower courts of appeals in states. There are state courts that deal with state laws. And the final arbiter on the state level is the state Supreme Court. And there are times where cases from the state Supreme Court can be advanced to the United States Supreme Court. But within the boundaries of the state itself, the state Supreme Court is the final arbiter of judicial matters within that state. Now, when you're talking about a state in this structure, a state is a big territory, right? And it's going to be rather difficult to just sort of have a governor and a judicial branch and a legislative branch just sort of pass law and then have these things actually be put into effect. So you have to have some sort of subdivision. Now, in a lot of states, not most states, but in a lot of states, the subdivisions are counties, followed by townships, followed by special districts, followed by municipalities. So let's talk about the first subdivision, which are counties. Now, counties are usually the largest political subdivision, and their primary function is to administer state laws within their borders. Among other duties, they keep the peace, maintain jails, collect taxes, build and repair roads and bridges, and record deeds, marriages, and deaths. Elected officials called supervisors or commissioners usually lead counties. And that's from ushistory.org. Now, just as it was with states and commonwealths, there are some naming differences of counties. For example, in Louisiana, a county is referred to as a parish. And in Alaska, those same political subdivisions are referred to as boroughs. So what are we talking about? Counties, parishes, or boroughs. There are political subdivisions with the same functions, no matter what they're called, that's responsible for administering laws within those defined areas that contain the counties. So let's take a look briefly at Fulton County, for example. Now, this is a very busy looking chart that sort of outlines the organizational structure of Fulton County, which I happen to live in the state of Georgia. Now, Fulton County is run by a board of commissioners, and those commissioners number 7, and those commissioners represent districts within Fulton County. So each district within Fulton County is divided into 7 districts, elect the commissioner. And the 7 commissioners decide on someone who's going to be the city manager. And that's going to be the person who's going to help unify decisions, help facilitate passing the decisions of the commissioner to the county. And in the case of Fulton County, that's going to be Dick Anderson. Now, if you take a look at this chart, you can see many of the functions that citizens need is covered in this organizational outline. We cover the core systems. We see things such as external affairs, emergency services, police department, the medical examiner, libraries, finance, human resources, public works, strategy and management office, tax commissioner, tax assessors, county auditors, county clerks, county attorneys. So, you go to the polls, and, oftentimes when we're not dealing with a presidential election or a government election, there are other offices and stuff that are on most ballots in states that people just don't know about, because you can see by looking at this chart that is very complicated. If you take a closer look at this chart and you take a look at the legend on the bottom left, you can see that the stuff that is shaded in gray are elected officers, right? So, for example, we talk about the district attorney, superior court, superior county clerk, the sheriff, the state court. This is an example. All of those are elected positions. All of those people have to appear on a ballot and run for office. And we as citizens who are busy working every day and, trying to live our lives, it's a lot to sort of grasp. It's a lot to try to understand who these people are, what they stand for, what their track record is, why you should vote for them. And I recognize that it is difficult, but it is something that is worth looking at. So, in between election cycles, and I'll give you a website at the end of this video, it's worth looking at who these people are and what they've done so you can have some sort of idea when you go back to the polls and vote to know exactly who you're voting for. One of the things I'm guilty of doing is if I don't know who the people are on these lower ballots, outside of the president and the governor, I tend to vote party, right? If I don't really know, what they stand for, and I see that they have a D by the name for Democrat, then I usually pick that. And that's something that people criticize. But honestly, it's also can be thought of as a tool to better assess how you should vote. We have a 2-party system in the United States and within most states. If you don't know who a particular person is that appear on a ballot, and you do see that they have either Republican or Democrat by their name, well, it is helpful to know that, because you understand at least generally what the platform for each one is. And even though you can't get into the weeds of that particular candidate, you have some general idea of where they stand. And so you can make a somewhat informed decision based on that. So that's not something that's necessarily a bad thing, but it is worth the time to look into these particular elected offices, get to know who these people are, so you can make a better informed decision when the time comes to vote. Now, a less common political subdivision is townships. Now, these units of government do not exist in about half the states, and they have different responsibilities than those that do have them. So a township in one state might have a different responsibility than a township in a different state. A township may be simply by another name for a town or a city, or it could be a subdivision of a county. So in some states you have a particular county, and then the next subdivision down from county would be township, and then down from there you get into your different districts and cities. Or sometimes it's just a town or a city, and they call it a township. So it is something that is not the majority in most of the states, but it is a political subdivision that is out there. And as stated here, they can be different depending on what state that you are as far as what their responsibilities are. Now, beyond that, we got special districts. Now, special districts are units of government that have special functions. They take care of particular needed special interest area. And one of the best known example is the local school district. You all are familiar with the terms of school board president, school board members. You know, these folks are in charge of deciding or running the educational responsibilities of citizens within special districts. Some other examples could be special court districts when you talk about judicial allocation. There could be certain transportation districts that handle certain transportation needs and stuff. But these are governing bodies who have the power to pass rules and regulations that the members within that district have to abide by. And it depends on what particular thing that they're dealing with. And in this case, our example is the school board. Finally, when we're talking about state subdivisions, we get down to municipalities. And that's where most of us live. Municipalities are cities, towns, or borough governments, and they get the authority to rule only as is granted by the state. Cities and towns are creations of the state. Now, about 80% of the American population lives in municipalities, and municipal governments affect the lives of many citizens. And they affect the lives of many citizens more directly than the state and the federal government will. As I mentioned earlier, municipalities may have elected mayors, or they may be managed and appointed city managers. I live in the city of Atlanta in the state of Georgia, and we have both a city manager, and we also have an elected mayor, and we also have a commission president who do many of the same day-to-day running the city as the mayor does. So, the states themselves, as stated before, is a Republican form of government, but they're pretty big. And one of the more practical ways of sort of running and making sure that the governments are running properly is to subdivide the state into different units to help make a more efficient governing actions. So in conclusion, we talked about the fact that all states have a Republican form of government. One of the things that we didn't specifically mention, one of the things I didn't specifically talk about, is that just like the federal government has a U.S. Constitution, most states have a state constitution. And state constitutions are generally more extensive than a U.S. Constitution because their laws are more specific to the issues and interests of those particular states. They're more focused. So they're going to contain more unique circumstances than the United States' more general approach. We talk about the fact that states generally are subdivided into counties, townships, special districts, and municipalities. All of that in the aim to better facilitate state law and to have a smooth and effective running government. So moving forward, I've hoped that we've developed some basic understanding of the similarities and differences between state and local governments. We have come to appreciate that state and local governments impact our everyday lives more than the federal government. Generally speaking, the closer in proximity a governing body is to you, the more impactful they are on your everyday lives. So if we're looking for an order of march, I would say that it's very important to understand and be involved with local municipal governments first, state government second, and finally federal government last. And that resource I spoke to is usa.gov/elected-officials. This is a great resource to help you find and contact who your local officials are. It also comes with some information on who these people are and ways to kind of email them and even call them if you have an issue. And I do encourage you to do so. So that's going to conclude this week's discussion on state governments. Next week, we're going to talk about municipal government. That's going to conclude our series on government in general. If you like what you heard today, please consider liking this video and consider subscribing to this channel. I want to thank you all for taking your time to watch The Informed Citizen this week. And I want you to remember to always love God, love yourself, and love each other. Until the next time, bye-bye.